Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Lisa, who I believe is back stateside. Lisa, are you joining us from the What's Your Grief office today?
I am back in Baltimore, and sort of having, I think, a lot of mixed emotions at the What's Your Grief office. That is, I don't know, I think it's like related to what we're talking about today on the podcast, because we have been talking about bidding farewell to the What's Your Grief office since we don't really use the office very regularly, like a lot of people's story. I think with COVID businesses, things changed for us, and we pivoted to, though we've always been online primarily, to like really being online. And when we got this office, I think we had a different vision where we might do more things in person and things like that. And now, as we're not doing that, we're thinking of just getting rid of the office. But I don't know. I think there's a lot wrapped up in that for me feels sort of sad to say goodbye to the office. It's surprising how attached I feel to it.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely feels like a part of the What's Your Grief story in a way. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this in many different ways, whether it's a home they've had to say goodbye to, or many people have kind of had to say goodbye to a business that they ran or a place that they worked or something of that nature, especially like you said, where COVID is concerned. And for us, I think we were able to pivot, but at one point, like you said, our hopes and dreams were wrapped up in doing these in-person events for people throughout Maryland and Baltimore. And we set it up with all those things in mind. I think that we were really very thoughtful and careful about the objects that we put in that space. I think, which is why we've held on to it so long. But at this point, it doesn't make sense for us to keep paying the rent, frankly. So, it's tough to realize that door is shut, really, in many ways. And like I said, we're lucky because we were able to pivot. For a lot of people, they close up a shop or something or a business, and that's it. It's finite. That's the end. And so I think, today we really wanted to take some time to talk about grieving places and spaces and homes, and to a lesser extent, objects, which we both feel is a much bigger conversation, talking about objects. But yeah, we really are people who connect with that idea that spaces are so much more than just physical spaces. There's so much wrapped up in it, and that they can cause significant loss when we have to say goodbye to them.
Yeah, it really is amazing, I think, when we think about how much is wrapped up in place and how easy it is to minimize that. And the office is certainly a representation of that to me in this moment. But I do think, in today's topic, getting into homes and other spaces, I hope that it resonates for people, because I think that it is something that sometimes doesn't get labeled and talked about nearly enough. And we're not going to talk as much today about the belonging side, though, of course, they were wrapped up together. So we talked a little bit about it. But if that is something that actually maybe speaks to you a little more than just the spaces, homes, places piece of things, next month in our Griever Hub and in our professionals community, the book club book that we're reading is Charlene Lamb's relatively new book, Curating Grief, which is a really amazing book that talks about belongings and just the incredible significance of objects in our grief. And so we'll be reading that and having a discussion about that. So please check out the communities if you might be interested in joining for that book club. And if not, like even just checking out the book because it is
Yeah.
a really beautifully done book about belongings.
Yeah. All right, without further ado, here is our discussion on grieving home and other places and spaces. So, today, what we want to talk about is just experiencing the loss of place, like loss of a home, and connected to that, when you experience the loss of really significant objects that, are tangible items. It's obviously going to be a non-death loss, but these are like really significant things that can cause a significant amount of grief and loss. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, just with all the wildfires that were going on in California a couple weeks back, just the devastation and the amount of loss that went on there. And seeing, on the news, people going back to these spaces and just the grief and shock that you can see on people's faces at experiencing all this loss. It really was making me think about this and just how important it is for people to acknowledge that this is such a significant loss that causes a significant amount of grief. And I think it often gets overlooked as a primary loss because it pertains to something that's tangible, that's a material possession. It's not a death loss. So I think that it does often get overlooked and maybe not labeled as a loss that causes grief. Also, I think it often comes as a secondary loss when people experience a loss like a death of a loved one or a divorce, things like that. Those things can lead to a situation where people experience the loss of a home and objects. And so it's a secondary loss that might get overshadowed by that primary loss or not really labeled as something that causes a lot of grief. And also, with all that, we know that people at the same time are dealing with that primary loss or all the other stressors that come along with losing a home. And so there isn't always like space and time to acknowledge the grief, but we think it's really important because this is one of those things, especially if it was a place that was really, really significant to you, that I feel like comes up for people like over time. It's something that like really sticks with you and that I think you think about a lot throughout your life. At least that's been my experience and the experience of a lot of people I've talked to. So I do think it's worthy of discussing and worthy of people at least acknowledging.
Yeah, and I was actually really discouraged to see during the wildfires just so much really negative minimizing commentary about belongings. And I think there was a lot wrapped up in that. I think obviously the fact that there were a number of people who have a lot of wealth who were losing their belongings. And there's obviously, especially at a moment where people feel a lot of economic division, there can be a lot of feelings of resentment that are just like wrapped up in all sorts of other things. But even beyond that, even beyond like the celebrity piece, I think there was a lot of that I saw a lot of people who were like, it's just belongings. They're just things. They're, it's just a house. It can be rebuilt, and I think that narrative is so harmful for people, like in any area of grief, when we feel like we don't have permission to acknowledge how deeply we are feeling affected by our loss. When you hear people in either your community, your family, on social media, on any sort of a space where you might be aware of how people are perceiving you and your grief, and you hear things that are minimizing or judgmental or critical, I think it really causes us to then question our own emotions, to judge ourselves a little bit. And I think with this, because there can be this narrative of like, oh, it could be worse. It's just stuff, it's just things. It, I think, does sometimes make people pause and think, oh, am I being shallow or materialistic or something, that I'm so upset about belongings when at least my family is safe or at least everything's okay. I think it really points to how much we struggle as individuals, as a society, to be able to hold two things at the same time, to be able to say, yes, it could be so much worse. And that doesn't mean it isn't still hard and painful and deeply a loss. Both of those things can be true.
I really think the statement "it could be worse" is only ever useful for the person experiencing the loss. And I say that meaning, like, I might say to myself, this is terrible, but at the same time, I'm so grateful that we got out safe and that my family's safe and that my animals are safe. In that instance, like, I see the benefit and I see the use in it. When it's someone else, it's creating this hierarchy where it's like, you haven't hit a threshold where you can say this is like bad or something that needs to be grieved. And like, it can always be worse. It's like, it can still be bad, even if it can be worse. And I think what you're talking about speaks a lot to how we place value. Like, we make value judgments about who or what someone has lost. And we do this with death losses too. Like, we might see someone has lost their grandparent and say, well, I wasn't close with my grandparent. It was just a grandparent. That can't cause that much grief because grandparents are distant and you don't see them that often. When that other person might have seen their grandparent on a daily basis, that grandparent might have raised them. And so we make these value judgments. And I do think with belongings, a lot of times, like, we don't see the significance of the objects. We don't know all the amazing memories that person might have made in a home. Maybe we ourselves are people who see houses as just houses and material possessions as just material possessions. There's nothing inherently wrong with having that outlook. However, we cannot assume that's how someone else feels. We cannot make a judgment about the value of what a person has in their lives and the impact of the loss of those things based on our own attachments, right? Because I do know, like, I think I'm somebody who is especially nostalgic about places, about home. And I'm somebody who feels like real homes have like a soul to them. But I know not everybody feels that way. And that might be sounding like a little hyperbolic to other people. But like, I don't know, I just don't think that we can make assumptions. I think you're right. I do think the fact that people saw that some celebrities were experiencing the losses and people who had a lot of wealth, and they did devalue it because of that. Oh, they have insurance or they can always rebuild. Well, yes, but like, there are intangible things that come along with tangibles that cannot be recovered.
Well, and I think that's really such an important part of this, is acknowledging how many intangibles there are that go with this. And sometimes it is those intangibles that are connected to our past and our history and people we've lost. And I think certainly with the wildfires, we saw so many people who lost all the family photos that they had, lost the only remaining objects or things that had been passed down through generations. Saw people online who lost, who had their, loved ones' ashes in the house and like lost things like that. And there is this sense that certain belongings feel like a connection to our history and to our past and to the people that we have lost, or even if we haven't lost them, like that just are connected through family. And I think that it's interesting because I think those intangibles on the hierarchy of things that get acknowledgement get a little bit more acknowledgement. Like, I think people do see, okay, if you lost family photos that can't be replaced and that you don't have, any photos of a person or any objects, there is maybe some acknowledgement of that. But even there's so many other things that are objects and belongings in a home that where there's intangibles, not necessarily because of generational history or someone who died, but where there's still real intangibles that are important to acknowledge.
Yeah, as a lot of people who listen to this podcast are grieving the loss of a loved one. Like, I feel like this should be something that makes a lot of sense to people, you know, because I do feel like when you lose someone, things start to feel like they have like more of a life of their own in a way. Maybe this is just me. This could very much just be me. I have a hard time like throwing away anything with like a face on it. You know what I mean? Like Toy Story, like rocked my world. It was so like upsetting. So maybe it's me. But I can't be the only one, right? But I do.
No, you're not the only one.
I do think when you lose somebody, like you start to see how these items, they become so much more significant than items, you know, like a loved one's toothbrush even, or shoes or things like that. And like you said, it doesn't necessarily have to connect to a loved one. It could connect to a really special time or a happy memory or things like that, things that you hold dear. So I just think there are so many different ways these things can be really significant to people. And they are, you know, everything we're kind of talking about is so incredibly personal. So it makes sense that other people wouldn't get it, you know, but at the same time, we need to make space as outsiders to accept that there are things we don't understand about what is important to other people.
And just that sense of place, right? That homes are oftentimes they're something where maybe we worked so incredibly hard to save and buy a home. And you, I think, sometimes see so much of that in the home, but then also just these places, right? Like the place where your child took their first steps, the place where you had your first Christmas with your partner, those sorts of things. It's the reason that even when we just move from a house to a new house, that there is so much that it feels like we have to say goodbye to that is important about that place. And I do think that gets underestimated.
Yeah. And we've been talking about the instance of when somebody loses a home due to circumstances outside of their control, right? So it could be a natural disaster. It could be some sort of financial hardship, maybe a loss of a job. It could be like being relocated for a lot of reasons, a lot of displacement going on in the world right now. There are so many reasons why this could happen. And I think that adds an extra layer of not just about those emotional, like nostalgic memory, special connection things, but it adds that extra layer of just feeling like home is a place where maybe we felt safe. And now I know not everybody feels safe in their home, but for a lot of people, home feels like a place where at least some of the stuff is in their control, where they can go to seek shelter and respite. And so I think this adds an extra layer. And this is something we've been talking about in the hub in one of the courses we were doing, just about how important that sense of safety and control is to us, and how grief and loss can really like throw it on its head. So I think, you know, thinking about that, even if you have resources, losing that place that where you felt like safe and in control, and it's a huge thing, you know, that is a huge thing, especially if there's uncertainty about where you're going to end up or where you're going to go next.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that idea, even when we go back to recently, something that came up in that course was just talking about saying goodbye to childhood homes. If you were lucky enough to, or not even just childhood homes, I think sometimes family homes, it's not necessarily the house where you grew up, but maybe it is the house where your family gathered, right? Maybe it was a grandparent's house, or it was the house that you associate with particular really safe and family connected memories. One of the discussions that came up was just how incredibly huge that loss can feel even when maybe you have your own home now, you feel like, wait, I've got my home. I do have a place where I'm safe and that I do have housing security. This isn't something that has disrupted my own living situation. But that there can still be a profound sense of loss connected to safety, because there was sort of something about always having that place, always having, whether it was a childhood home or a family home, a place to know that this is where family comes together. This is a place that holds memories that go back for many years or sometimes generations. And when that's gone, it can destabilize a sense of home, even when we still have the home we live in. And I think that can be a sort of an unexpected experience for people, especially if they feel really settled in their own home and love their own home for all sorts of reasons. It doesn't change that this other home meant a tremendous amount.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the fact that, you know, even when the loss of the place or items or objects was a decision that you made, it was something in your control. Maybe you moved, you sold your home and moved. Maybe it was just sort of the natural progression, like you grew up and left home. How even when all those things are true, you can still experience this profound sense of loss. And I mentioned, like, I feel like home is something that for many people is a theme that comes up throughout their life, and the loss of a home. And I really feel like in what you just said, like, I feel like that comes through because as you continue to grow older and time passes and you experience more loss, I feel like the loss of that place can really just add to that sense that there's a piece of your history and life that is disappearing and gone. And that I feel like is, like you said, really kind of destabilizing and sad in a lot of different ways. But it's something that I know we've talked about this a lot with people. And I feel that this is true, that I feel like this sense of loss in a way gets a little bit stronger for me as time passes, interestingly, and as the change around that original place continues to grow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that when we were going to talk about this topic, I obviously was reflecting on my childhood home when it was, I guess, 2017 now, 2018, that I spent a year of my life just consumed by going through belongings and fixing that house up, and then ultimately selling it. And one of the things that was really interesting is that at the time I was so buried in the practicalities of like having to deal with it, and it was emotional. There was things about stuff that was emotional. There was things about saying goodbye to the house that was emotional. But I think that for me, as somebody who does go into like action mode and problem solving mode and just like, okay, this needs to get taken care of. Like this has to happen. And there was a lot of complexities that went into that. And it was like, there was a lot. But I think that in a lot of ways, I didn't give myself nearly as much space for what an impact that loss was, some of the emotional space. And I do think over the years I have felt sadder as time has gone on about it, for a lot of different reasons. I mean, certainly the house being gone, but also I feel like I didn't give myself as much space and permission to sort of say goodbye because I was consumed with all the things I had to take care of.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just made me really aware of that for, I don't know, for the future, just as a thing.
It's just so weird. Like, it's just like such a finite loss, but at the same time, like you live kind of around where you grew up. And
Yeah.
so it's like you can go back, but it's gone. And that's what's weird. I just visited my dad the other day and he still lives in the area. Actually, my sister still lives in the house I grew up in, but I always go to my dad's house. And I always feel like it's so weird to be back there because it's like you can go back, but you can't go back. It's
Yes.
gone, but it's still there. It's so weird. I said to my, and I went back to the high school I went to, and I hadn't been back in so long. And it's like it's so odd. But it does. You know what it reminds me of? We talk about with continuing bonds. Early, continuing bonds are those behaviors that you use to try and maintain connections with the people who've died. And a lot of times they're things that bring you a lot of warmth and comfort over time, because they connect you to that person and they kind of allow you to carry them forward in your life. But in the early kind of weeks or months, a lot of people use those types of behaviors to kind of try and reach out to the person who died, seeking them, and they find that they're not there in the way they want them to be, which is physically there. And they are filled with kind of hopelessness and despair. And for some reason, that's how I feel when I like try to go back to a place. Like I feel hopelessness and despair. Maybe that's a little extreme. I feel probably a mix, but I feel more sad than anything because it's just not there anymore. Does that make sense?
No, I think that makes total sense. And it's really interesting. I think that even that idea of how you have family who live in that house that you grew up in, I would imagine that in some ways that might even intensify that feeling because it's both that place and not that place at the same time. Like it's both that home that you grew up in and not the home that you it's like it's the house that you grew up in, but not the home that you grew up in. And I imagine there's a dissonance there.
Yeah, it's so weird. I said to my dad when I was on my way there, I talked to him on the phone when I was on my way there, and I was like, it was just random. It came up because my sister lives in the house, and I'm like, and her kids go to the high school I went to, and I'm like, I wonder if it feels a lot different to be her than me, because when I go back, I'm filled with this sense of like, I don't know, it's like almost a mysterious kind of nostalgic, like haunting feeling. And but this is her day to day. So is she surrounded by it too? Is she surrounded by? I should have asked her. I didn't think to, but like, what does it feel like for her? Does it come up for her? And is it like, or is it just like normal? Like, I don't know. It's weird. I'm going to have to ask her because I guess my question is like, is there a difference between like being there in the place surrounded by the memories, which many of our listeners probably are, and being distant from that place? I don't know.
Yeah. And I don't know. I imagine part of it is that she's been part of that evolution. So, maybe it's like how you don't notice something when it's happening every day versus for you being away and coming back. I'm sure it's
like that thing when you go back to somewhere, it's like so different, not what you remembered it like, or it's like suddenly smaller or more shabby or whatever it is. It's never how you remembered it from when you were like younger. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because I mean, as we're talking about it, we are people who both grew up and just like left the home, Yeah. And so for us, the grief is palpable. The loss is palpable. Like it's a part of our narrative. So you can see how somebody who experienced not just the loss of the home, but like the inability, like you were able, at least, and I don't mean to use the word at least, but you know what I'm saying? You were able to engage with the home and have some control over what happened with the home, and I'm able, if I want to go back and visit the home. And for the people who have no power and no control in that, I would imagine that really adds to the complicated and intense feelings they may have if this is something that is significant and important to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if I've told you this, that in this house that I live in now, this is the first place I have ever lived that multiple times people have come to the door here because one person used to live in this house, and the other person lived in the house that's across the street from here, but actually it's gone. It burned down, the house that's like across the street. So now it's just an empty lot. And this person knocked on my door, and it was during COVID, and she had a mask on. That was kind of like at a time where it was just like, it was like weird for somebody to be at your door. And you know me, because I am like, do not ever come by my house unannounced. So I was like, who is at my door? And she was like, I'm so sorry to bother you. This is going to sound like a really weird question. She was like, but did there used to be a house there? And the house is burned down. Like you almost can't tell that there ever used to be a house there. Like it looks like it could have just always been this vacant space. And we had this long conversation about it because I knew that there used to be a house there and whatever. And she was just talking about how she was driving through Baltimore. She was from Baltimore, and she just really wanted to come back and go past this house that she grew up in. And she was like, I didn't even live there for my whole childhood, but it like sort of, it was clearly like a place that was like very formative for her. And I was able to tell her that actually you can see the house in a show that was filmed in Baltimore. And I knew that from my old neighbor. So I was like, well, I know this isn't the same, but, and then a second time, somebody else came by and had grown up in this house. And I don't know. It just really made me think. In both cases, they said they didn't have any pictures of the house. And that was a huge thing that made both of them kind of like want to come by the house. And both of them had circumstances where just lost belongings and and just didn't have any photographs. And said like, it's just so weird to like not have to picture this place in your mind, and you don't have any photographic memory of it. So part of it felt like it was both a loss of the home, but it was also really the loss of photographs and like not having any kind of evidence that this whole part of your life existed in this place. And obviously I was like the best person ever to answer the door in these situations, because I am here for all your feelings. Yes. Like I completely understand why this is such kind of an emotional thing. And, you know, in the one case, it had been her grandmother's house and her grandmother had died. You know, it was just sort of this feeling of like, I've lost my grandmother. We don't have any photos. And like, I have this memory of this place. And I just,
It is interesting. Like when you think about the different like types of grief, how you grieve a person versus a tangible item.
Yeah.
There are fewer threads, you know. With a person, you have memories of like the things they said to you, the values that they had. You have a lot of different things to sort of hold on to. And with places, it's not really like that. Like you have your memory and that's it. And unless you have photos or some sort of other piece, that's why one of the things we say to people, if they are in control but they know that they're moving on from a place they're going to grieve, to take those photos, to like even do a photo shoot in the home before you leave, to take an item that, you know, a doorknob or a brick or something that came from that space, because I do think that there's less to kind of grasp. And especially if it's a place from early on in your life, you don't always trust those memories. And research has shown our memories is not completely accurate and trustworthy. So I totally get that, and why you would be drawn to do something like that, to go back to that place and be in that space.
Yeah, just to be able to like see that place again. And I'll never forget when we ran that group. Remember Ellen, a woman told us, you know, that the town where she had grown up, I can't remember even exactly what the circumstances were, but essentially the town was just gone.
Yeah.
And she had gone back to try to see it, and it just didn't exist anymore. And I think that sense of place that we have, and again, I should say that in some ways we're lucky if we do have it. Like, obviously some people bounced around their a whole life. They didn't have that sense of place. They, you know, or they moved around a lot and they didn't have it. But if you did have it, I think it's really disorienting sometimes to feel like I can't go back. I can't connect with it. I don't have connection to it. It's strange. And again, that other people might minimize it. Like, if you want to share stories of the person that you lost, I think people
get it.
People expect that. They get it. If you're like, oh, let's just talk about that house. That sounds a little different.
Right. And, you know, like you just said it, there are many people who maybe didn't have it, and they maybe had to learn a different way to define home. You know what I mean? Like, maybe they found it to be more something that feels very internalized and travels with them, and so on and so forth. Or maybe you're just somebody who feels very pragmatic and not emotional about these things. And that all those other ways of being are totally fine. This conversation is just to validate, if you do feel this way, that is totally normal and common, and something a lot of people experience. And, you know, we've talked about, like, when it's connected to the past, when it's connected to your sense of just like safety and comfort and security. But I also think just one last piece of it is to acknowledge that for many people who have to leave a home, for many people, there was a lot of hopes and dreams about the future invested in that space. You know, you might mourn any dreams you had associated with a place or with objects. Like, maybe that idea of, like, we were supposed to retire here. Maybe me and my partner were supposed to retire here, but my partner's died and now I have no choice but to move. Maybe it is an object. We've talked to a lot of people who've had objects in hopes of having children, and then they weren't able to have children, or they experienced a stillbirth, and giving those things away. There's a lot of emotion and grief attached to it because of the hopes and the dreams that they had for those objects and for those places. And it also might signal that you're just moving into a stage of life that you really feel kind of mixed about, right? Like, we talk to a lot of people who are moving into like retirement communities, and for them, it's like a mix, right? It's a mix of leaving that home that you had with your kids or whoever you lived with, and moving into an entire new place, which is just a different chapter. Anytime we take on a new chapter, I think we can be mixed. I think people who are moving for a new career, a lot of times it can be a really mixed blessing and a really mixed kind of outlook. So I think just also to acknowledge that there's a lot of future feelings that might be wrapped up in places and in objects that people are dealing with. And again, those are incredibly specific and individual to that person. And so it can be hard to really see everything that is involved in these losses from the outside in. But I think if we're talking about looking at this from the perspective of a support person, because we have brought that into the conversation, like, the best thing you can do is just allow these things to exist, like understand that these things can exist, and allow for the possibility that they may, and, you know, following the person's lead in terms of how they're responding and what they're expressing.
Yeah. And I think, you know, doing the same for ourselves, just giving ourselves the space for it, and, you know, feeling comfortable acknowledging how heavy it may feel, even if it isn't the primary loss, or even if you are telling yourself it could be worse, and all of those things. It's still important to just make the space for it.
Well, we've written quite a bit on this, actually. As you can probably tell, we're two people who resonate very deeply with the idea of grieving places and things.
Yes.
So we have actually written a lot on this. So we will link to some of those things. I think in the show notes, we have at least one or two articles that have just like helpful tips for like what to do if you are saying goodbye to a home. But then we have a whole series of things about when you are going through the process of a loved one, dealing with a loved one's belongings.
Yeah, which is really like a whole other thing.
Yes, exactly. Like it's related, but also very much different. And I think we just have a couple of different articles about just the sentimentality of objects and things like that. So we will share those. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. If you have topic suggestions or questions, you can reach us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com.